The papers were signed on a Thursday, 41 years of my life, and it ended with a handshake in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and somebody else's cologne. The buyer's attorney slid the final document across the table. I signed my name for the last time as owner of Caldwell Mechanical Solutions, and just like that, I walked out into the Cincinnati afternoon with $47 million and nowhere to be on Monday morning. I drove home the long way, past the original shop on Beachmont Avenue where I'd started with 2 employees and a used lathe, past the high school where I'd worked weekends at 16 to save up my first $1,000. I wasn't sentimental about it. I'd made my decision, I'd gotten a fair price, and I was 63 years old and tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix anymore. My wife Barbara had passed 4 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer. 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I still wasn't used to coming home to a quiet house, but I'd learned to make peace with quiet. It was the noise that rattled me now. The particular noise of my son Gregory and his wife Nadine circling something they wanted. Gregory was 36. Smart kid. Genuinely smart. The kind that made you proud at parent-teacher conferences and then somehow never quite translated all that intelligence into anything that stuck. He'd tried real estate for a while, then some kind of app company with a college friend, then a consulting firm that operated out of a shared office space downtown. He made decent money. Not great money. Enough to drive a car that was slightly too expensive for his income. Enough to take vacations that showed up on his social media, but not in his savings account. Nadine was the one who wore the financial anxiety in the family. She wore it on her face, in the way she watched me whenever the subject of money came up, in the way her eyes moved around my house during visits. Calculating. Always calculating. I'd noticed it early in their marriage and told myself I was being uncharitable. She was a good-looking woman, organized, capable. She kept the house immaculate. She remembered birthdays. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, the way you do when your son loves someone and you want to love them too. But there are things you can't unsee once you've seen them. The retirement party was my idea. Barbara would have wanted something. She was always the one who marked occasions properly. The birthdays, the anniversaries, the milestones. Since she'd been gone, I'd let too many of those moments pass without acknowledgement, and selling the business felt like the kind of thing she would have insisted we celebrate. So I rented out the private dining room of the precinct, which had been our family's special occasion restaurant since Gregory was a boy, and I invited the people who had actually mattered over the years. My business partner of 30 years, Ed Hartman and his wife, my accountant, a sharp woman named Frances, who had saved me from myself on more tax decisions than I could count. My oldest friend, a retired firefighter named Garrett. Garrett Purcell, who I'd known since the 3rd grade. My neighbor, May, who'd brought casseroles to my door for 6 months after Barbara died and who I considered family at this point. A handful of others. 12 people total, seated around a long table with good wine and steakhouse bread, the way it should be. Gregory and Nadine drove separately. They arrived 20 minutes after everyone else. Nadine had on a dress I'd never seen before, and she'd had her hair done. She looked, if I'm being honest, like she was dressed for an occasion more significant than what this actually was. Gregory hugged me at the door and said, "Big night, Dad," and I couldn't tell if he meant it warmly or if he was doing the thing he sometimes did, where he made a statement that sounded like affection but was really a reminder of something he thought he was owed. Dinner was good. The ribeye was exactly what I remembered. Garrett told the story about the fishing trip to Lake Erie we'd taken in 1987, the version where I fall off the dock, and everyone at the table laughed in the right places. Ed gave a short toast about what I'd built and what it had taken to build it, and he got choked up at the end in a way that made me look down at my plate because I wasn't ready to be emotional in front of people. It was after the main course, during that in-between stretch when the plates have been cleared and the wine is low and the conversation gets looser, but things shifted. Gregory leaned forward in his chair. He'd been quiet for most of dinner, which wasn't like him. He usually worked a room. but he'd been nursing his second glass of Merlot and watching the table in a way that I now recognize as someone rehearsing something. "So, Dad," he said, and something in my stomach tightened at the tone before he even finished the sentence. "Now that everything's finalized, you must have some thoughts about what you're doing with the proceeds." Garrett looked at his water glass. Ed's wife found something to study on the far wall. They were good enough friends to know this wasn't their conversation. "I've got a plan," I said. "Frances has been helping me think through it." Gregory nodded slowly. "That's good. That's smart." He paused. "Nadine and I have actually been doing some thinking too." I waited. "The market's really tough right now," he said, "for people our age, trying to build equity. We've been looking at some investment properties. There's actually a development outside of Columbus that we've been researching for about a year. Mixed use, really smart concept. The entry point is—" "Greg," I said quietly. He stopped. "This is my retirement party," I said. The table had gone still. Not awkward still. Everyone there was an adult. But the kind of still where people are politely not hearing a private conversation. Gregory sat back. Nadine touched her wine glass but didn't drink from it. She smiled, the careful smile she kept in reserve for moments when the conversation wasn't going the way she'd planned. "I know," Gregory said. "I'm not trying to make it into a thing. I just thought." "Let's enjoy tonight," I said. "We can talk later." He nodded. Nadine's smile didn't change. We got through dessert. Creme brulee, Barbara's favorite, which I'd specifically requested and now sat in front of me mostly untouched. Garrett was telling a story. Ed's wife was asking Frances something about a trip to Portugal. The table had relaxed back into itself. I excused myself to say something to our server about the check. When I came back, I was approaching from behind Nadine, who was turned slightly away from the table, and I saw something I was not meant to see. She was bent slightly forward over the table. Between my place setting and Gregory's there were 3 glasses, mine, Gregory's, and an extra that had been left from a toast earlier. My glass was the one nearest my seat, a deep pour of Cabernet that I barely touched because I'd been watching my intake since Frances had flagged some things in my most recent blood work. Nadine had something in her hand, something small, a folded paper packet, the kind that might hold a single serving of something powdered. Her movements were quick, practiced even, and she tipped the contents into my glass, then tucked the empty packet into the small clutch bag on the table beside her. She picked up her own glass and turned back toward the conversation as if she'd simply reached across for something. I stopped walking. I'm not a man who panics easily. I built a 41-year business by staying calm when equipment failed and contracts fell through and employees quit without notice. Whatever I felt in that moment, it arranged itself quickly into something I could manage. I walked back to my seat. I sat down. I looked at my glass. I thought about the cholesterol medication I took every morning and the blood thinner I'd started in January, and whether either of those things combined with whatever was in my glass might be the explanation for what I'd just seen. I thought about the simpler explanations, a sweetener, an antacid, something benign. I looked at Nadine's face and she was laughing at something Garrett had said, relaxed, easy, and I knew, whatever she had put in that glass, the expression on her face in the moment she did it was not the expression of someone dissolving a sweetener. I looked around the table. Her father, a retired electrician named Dale who had driven up from Lexington for the evening, was sitting 2 seats to my left. He was a quiet man, kind, the sort of father-in-law I might have enjoyed under different circumstances. He was on his 3rd glass of something and looked comfortable and happy. His glass was closer to me than mine. I made a decision in about 4 seconds. I reached across my plate under the pretense of moving the breadbasket, and I switched the glasses. Mine in front of Dale. Dale's in front of me. I waited to see if anyone had noticed. No one had. Then I picked up Dale's original glass and said to no one in particular, "I need to say something." The table quieted. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," I said. "This restaurant, these people, This is exactly what Barbara would have wanted. I paused. Let that land for a moment. Before we toast, I need to address something, and I'm sorry that it has to be now in front of everyone, but I don't think it can wait. Gregory looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Nadine had gone very still. About 5 minutes ago, I said, keeping my voice even, I watched someone at this table empty a packet of something into my wine glass. I didn't look at Nadine when I said it. I looked at the table in general. I've already switched the glasses. The glass that was mine is sitting in front of Dale right now. I want Dale to please not drink from it. Dale looked down at the glass in front of him and pushed it slightly away, as if it had said something to him personally. Garrett looked at me. Ed looked at me. Then everyone looked at Nadine. Her face had done something complicated. The smile was gone. What replaced it was a kind of blankness, the look of someone running through options very fast and not liking any of them. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. The packet is in your clutch bag, I said. The empty one. Gregory said, Dad. Gregory, I said, I'm not asking for a discussion. I'm telling you what I saw. You're saying my wife tried to. He stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. I'm saying I don't know what she put in that glass, I said. I'm saying she put something in it. I'm saying I'm 63 years old and I've been dealing with people my entire professional life and I know what I saw. Garrett, who'd been a first responder for 28 years and had a particular relationship with clarity in a crisis, said very calmly, Nadine, would you open your bag, please? She didn't move. Nadine, Ed said. She looked at Gregory. Gregory looked at her, and whatever he saw in her face in that moment, something changed in his. Not all at once, but something behind his eyes shifted, the way ice shifts before it breaks. Open the bag, he said. His voice was quiet and not entirely steady. She reached in. She put the small folded paper packet on the table. It was white. The kind of thing that might have once held a single serving powder. There was residue inside, visible even from where I was sitting. Frances, who had spent 30 years as an accountant and had the instincts of a woman who had seen people try to hide things in paperwork for decades, said, Don't touch it. Nobody else touch it. I said, I'd like to call the police now. Nadine said, It was just her, and then stopped, because there was no good ending to that sentence. The server, a young man named whoever he was, who had been an excellent server all evening, and did not deserve to have his Saturday turn into a crime scene, came over to ask if everything was all right. I asked him to call 911 and to make sure nobody left the room. He looked at the table, at the general atmosphere of a retirement dinner that had collapsed into something else entirely, and he nodded and went to do exactly that. The police arrived within 8 minutes. 2 officers, both professional, both measured. They took the packet into evidence. It was photographed in place first, then bagged. They spoke to each person at the table separately. They asked Nadine if she wanted to make a statement, and she said she wanted a lawyer, which was probably the first truly smart decision she'd made all evening. Gregory sat in his chair for a long time after Nadine was escorted out by the officers to wait in the lobby. He sat there with his hands on the table in front of him and said nothing. I didn't push him. Some things a man has to sit with before he can speak about them. Eventually he said, I didn't know. I believe you, I said. Dad. I know. I had no idea she would. He stopped. What was she thinking? What did she think was going to happen? I've been asking myself the same thing since about 8 o'clock, I said. The lab results came back 9 days later. The powder was a combination of 2 medications, one a blood thinner that would have interacted severely with the blood thinner I was already on, the other something typically prescribed for cardiac rhythm, combined with alcohol and my existing prescriptions. The attending physician who reviewed the report told me it could have caused a serious cardiac event. He used the word serious. He said it the way doctors say words when they mean something worse. I sat in my kitchen and held that information for a while before I called Frances. Then I called my attorney. Gregory and Nadine's marriage did not survive the arrest. I won't say more about that than necessary, because whatever my feelings about Nadine, my son's pain is his own. He moved out of their house in February. He called me on a Tuesday evening in March and we talked for 2 hours, the longest real conversation we'd had in years. He cried. I didn't, but not because I didn't feel it. Some things happen and the grief of them takes a different form. He told me he'd known their finances were bad, worse than he'd let me know. There were credit cards I hadn't heard of, a second mortgage on their house, debt to a person in their social circle that had started as a personal loan and gotten complicated. He hadn't told me because he was embarrassed, and because he had hoped it would resolve itself, and because Nadine had told him not to. He had believed her when she said they could handle it. He had wanted to believe her. I understood wanting to believe the people you love. Nadine was charged with criminal poisoning and related charges. Her attorney negotiated. These things always end in negotiation when the evidence is clear and the options are limited. She entered a plea, and the sentencing was what it was. I won't say I felt nothing, but I also won't say I felt what I expected to feel. Mostly, I felt tired, and relieved that Dale hadn't drunk from that glass. Dale, for his part, sent me a card. Handwritten, 3 sentences. The last one said that he was sorry for what his daughter had done, and that he hoped I'd live a long and peaceful life. I thought about the kind of man who writes a letter like that, and I thought that Gregory could have done worse in a father-in-law, even if he'd done badly in a wife. The conversation I needed to have with Gregory about money was different than the one he'd been preparing to have with me at the precinct. I didn't give him what he asked for. I never would have. Not because I'm a hard man, but because a pile of money handed to someone who hasn't figured out how to manage their own is not generosity. It's just postponing a problem. What I did was different. Francis and I set up a structure, a trust, managed properly, with real conditions, and a financial advisor Gregory was required to work with for 2 years before he could access any principal. Not because I don't trust him, but because trust is built on structure, and Gregory had been allowed to float without structure for too long. Some of that was on me. I'd been so busy building something for him to inherit that I'd forgotten to teach him how to tend to it. He pushed back at first, then he didn't. Then, about 6 months into working with the advisor, he called me on a Sunday morning and said he'd never understood compound interest before. Actually understood it. He sounded like he was 22 and had just figured out something basic about the world, and I wanted to laugh, and I wanted to cry a little, and I did neither because I was driving and the light had just turned green. I go to the precinct still 2 or 3 times a year. Different table. I always order the ribeye. Garrett comes when he's in town, and Francis and May, and occasionally Ed, though his knees are bothering him more lately and he doesn't love the parking situation downtown. We sit at that table and we eat well and we have the kind of conversation that is only possible between people who have known each other long enough to skip the pretending. I'm 64 now. I sleep well most nights. The house is still quiet, but I've come to understand that quiet is not the same as empty. It just means you have to furnish it yourself. I go to the shop on Beachmont sometimes and drive past slowly, and the new owners have repainted the facade a color Barbara would have hated, and I think about telling her that, and then I don't. And then I'm glad for the whole 41 years anyway. There is one thing I come back to when I think about that evening, not the anger of it, and not the fear of what might have been, but a smaller thing. The moment I switched those glasses quietly, while Garrett was talking and Ed's wife was laughing, and nobody was looking at the man at the head of the table making the only decision that made sense to him. I didn't hesitate. That's what I think about. After 63 years of running a business and raising a son and losing a wife and making 10,000 decisions under pressure, my hands were steady and I didn't hesitate. Barbara would have said, that's the only kind of man worth being. I keep coming back to something Dale wrote in that card. 3 sentences from a man whose daughter had just been arrested at my retirement dinner, and he used one of them to wish me a long and peaceful life. That kind of decency, from someone who had every reason to be too ashamed to reach for a pen. I don't take it lightly. It told me something about how people are shaped, and also how they can go wrong despite being shaped well. Nadine didn't become who she was in a vacuum. Somewhere along the way, she decided that wanting something was enough justification to take it. That the math of other people's lives, their work, their sacrifice, their years, could simply be redirected toward her own plans without consequence. That's not just greed. That's a failure of something deeper, the kind of moral foundation that either gets built early or doesn't get built at all. You can't patch it later with ambition or charm or a careful smile across a dinner table. It shows up eventually. It always does. Gregory failed too, though differently. He knew their finances were bad and let the embarrassment of it outweigh the honesty it required. He wanted to believe the problem would resolve itself because believing that was easier than facing it with me directly. I understand that impulse. I've felt versions of it myself over the years, but understanding it doesn't make it harmless. The willingness to look clearly at hard things, to think through consequences before acting and not after, that's not a personality trait you either have or don't. It's something you practice or you don't. Gregory hadn't been practicing. What I did that night at the precinct, switching those glasses, staying calm, waiting for the right moment to speak, wasn't instinct exactly. It was 63 years of having to think clearly under pressure and choosing, every time, to keep thinking rather than react. You build that capacity the same way you build anything, slowly, imperfectly, by doing it when it's difficult and not just when it's easy. I made wrong calls over the years. Plenty of them. But I made them honestly, and I tried to learn from them. And by the time I needed to be steady at that dinner table, I was steady. The trust I set up for Gregory isn't punishment. I want him to understand that. It's the thing I should have built years earlier. A structure that required him to develop the skills I'd been too busy to teach him. Because I was building the thing I assumed he'd inherit, rather than the judgment he'd need to manage it. That was my failure as much as anyone's. I'm trying to correct it now, late as it is. Garrett called me about a month after everything settled. He said, "You held it together better than I would have." I told him I wasn't sure that was true. He said, "I know it is. I was watching your hands." I thought about that for a long time afterward. About what it means to hold yourself together, not for show, but because the moment requires it, and you've put in enough years that your hands know what to do, even when your chest doesn't. That's what 41 years built. Not the $47 million, not the company, not the legacy or whatever word people use. It built a man who could sit at his own retirement dinner, watch something terrible happen, and respond with clarity instead of collapse. Barbara would have handled it better probably, she always did. But she would have been glad I held my own.